Welcome, everyone. Thank you for extending your day. I know it's been a long day of study and discussion and lectures. We're pleased you can make it here for Daniel Polikoff's book launch event for Apocalypse of the Modern Mind. You can see up there the flyer for Daniel's book. And it's part of a series. It's the second volume of a series of books called Reset or Renaissance that sprung out of Daniel's deep engagement with events of the COVID era. And Daniel's known to us all here as professor and colleague and friend. So Daniel, and his capacity of all those capacities, shared with me his idea for Volume 1, a book on COVID, coming out of his experience of some of the societal changes that COVID initiated, if I can put it in those terms. And I took a personal interest in what Daniel was writing. This was 2021, I think. Having myself, I got vaccinated. I had the Moderna vaccine for COVID, along with my wife in May of 2021, and suffered quite a really bad COVID vaccine injury. We both did. We both had the same shot at the same time. And, I think I discussed with Daniel at one point, including something in my story in the book, and I decided against it. And really the reason for that is that I was just too damaged by what had happened at the time. But I watched with interest from the side as Daniel developed his thesis that went into the first volume. And then I had the opportunity to write an endorsement for the second volume, which I gladly did. And it's a real fine piece of work. And I got the sense, and Daniel, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that the material was kind of like flowing out of you. It was just like an eruption of stuff that needed to be said. Like the unconscious was coming forth quite powerfully in this flow of words that gave birth to these two volumes, with more volumes, I believe, on the way. So that's often an indication of something. If there's something important to say, you're in the grip of a flow of ideas that wants to come through, that has its form. And then the labor becomes giving shape to that form. So Daniel has articulated in both volumes a controversial position in terms of where the dominant mainstream narrative is with respect to COVID, vaccinations, lockdowns, and other issues. But it's also an opportunity. I think Daniel takes the crisis of COVID as an opportunity for a kind of renewal, renaissance, as he says, of spiritually informed democratic ideals. And to do that, he looks back to Emerson, particularly, and the roots of American democracy. So I think we're going to hear Daniel talk about that. Pacifica itself was involved in the events of that time. I mean, like any organization, it had to enforce vaccine mandates. So Daniel was also coming from a perspective of being a professor at Pacifica and not being allowed to come to campus and not being allowed to continue in his role as adjunct professor. And I was caught in the middle of this too, because I was the chair, and given what happened to me, I had my sympathies, especially with Daniel's position. But of course, we had to follow the rules. So we both, in different ways, I think, experienced the difficulties of that time. And it gave us, again, probably in slightly different ways, but in similar ways too, a unique insight into what was happening at the time, and particularly questions of censorship and the way that even supposedly liberal governments became somewhat authoritarian at the time and seemed to digress from what were imagined as ongoing, cherished liberal values. And I think that was perhaps the biggest shock, at least to me at the time. So I won't say much more. Daniel will explain his work much better than I have, but I did want to give you that context. Okay, so without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Daniel Polikoff. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran, for that wonderful introduction. There's only one thing I would perhaps disagree with, which is that I'll do a better job introducing my work than you just did. That was just really, you say a lot in a very short period of time. It's one of Kieran's talents. Yes, so as Kieran indicated, the Reset or Renaissance project, this multi-volume project, grew out of COVID, what I call COVID world. And I think one thing that we could all agree upon is that COVID was a dramatic world historical, world-changing in many ways event. Nobody was unaffected by what transpired, especially at the height of the pandemic, those few most intense COVID years, beginning in 2020, running through 2021, 2022. And then, of course, the pandemic petered out somewhat. And most people at present don't want to think about it anymore. Would just like to see it as something in the rearview mirror. It's not a popular topic, doesn't sell books. In fact, Amazon is suppressing mine. Anything with COVID in the title is suspect. But that's not the perspective that I would like to bring to us tonight. I think COVID was obviously an event of tremendous significance, what transpired there, and actually understanding what happened and why is very organic to understanding of what's to come. And the COVID years and what unfolded politically, socially, psychologically during those years, I see as very much of a piece with what is still transpiring, even though many of the logistics are different. But many of the issues, if not all the significant issues, are very much still on the table. And many of the kinds of responses or handlings of those concerns as a body politic are still very much in force. So, like good psychologists, I think it's needs recognizing that we need to retrieve a more thorough understanding of what we've been through, the immediate past, in order to plot a hopefully more constructive path towards the future. As Kieran said, Pacifica did play a role in igniting this project. One thing I'll say in response to Kieran's mention of the work or material kind of flowing through me, in a certain sense, that's true. I mean, I worked damn hard writing these books, just didn't channel it. But it is very true in this respect. That is, I never planned to write these books at all. In fact, the way the first volume got started was I had just finished the first chapter of a long-planned book on Ralph Waldo Emerson. I wrote my dissertation on Emerson many, many, many years ago, and then I kind of got on a Rilke trip, which I pursued for a quarter of a century, and that finally worked my way back to Emerson, and just finished the first chapter of a book on Emerson in early 2020, when COVID kind of came around big time. I remember my son was going to school as a freshman at University of Colorado at Boulder. And one week, I believe it was, early March or February, the word from the campus was, everything's going on normally, we're staying open. The next day, whoosh, shut down. He's driving home in a snowstorm over the Sierras, and campus was emptied overnight. So there was a dramatic shift very quickly when the COVID phenomenon really hit. And of course it hit here too. And indeed, the way the book got started was I knew that vaccine mandates were potentially in the pipe for Pacifica, as they were for, most public institutions. And so January 29th, 2021, I sat down to write a letter to Joseph Cambry, the then president of Pacifica, to discourage Pacifica from imposing vaccine mandates, or at least stake out a position of understanding that this was not something that was embraced by the institution, even if it had perhaps to do such and such to follow the letter of the law, that Pacifica not take a stand that, for one thing, would exclude anyone who didn't want to vaccinate, like myself, from being part of what was going on. That letter grew like pasta in a pot, and it blew up into eventually 75 pages, which of course I didn't send to Joe Cambry. He got a page and a half, which are in the book, the original letter that I did send to him. But the reason it expanded like that is because COVID was actually a very complex, multifaceted phenomenon, and so much was going on. So when I wanted to kind of elaborate what I felt about this aspect, the censorship aspect, or the suppression of safe treatments and so forth, I just went from one to the other, and of course it became quite lengthier than I had anticipated. And that's part of what I wanted to mention, is that not only didn't I plan to write the book, and that letter grew into the 75 pages, which became part one of the first volume of the book. And then I thought, I'm done with it. But then there was just a little bit more I had to explain. And so I went on, and it ended up in 2 volumes, close to 1,000 pages. And at no point did I have a plan of the structure of the book or know what was going to be in the next chapter. I think I'd better talk a little bit about transhumanism. So that comes into it. Or I'd better talk about this a little bit. And it is what's to me kind of a little bit remarkable about, 2 lengthy books, is that the organization of the book really came from the unconscious, and from what was coming outside is what presented itself to me. Because as I say, there was no table of contents that I planned out in my mind. It kind of unfolded organically. So the purview of the first book, the contents, and I just cite a little bit from the introduction. What is the first volume, which is called Reset or Renaissance? The whole series is called Reset or Renaissance: Life, Liberty, and the Quest for Enlightenment in a Post-COVID World. And the first volume is called Two Roads: An American Scholar's COVID Chronicle. So the first volume is really focuses on, and it's a real-time chronicle. I was writing it as these things were unfolding. And what's it about? Well, in brief, what COVID was about: pandemonium, fear and suffering, lockdowns, social distancing and masking, the dream of a saving vaccine and the no-holds-barred drive to realize it, the politicization and consequent compromise of science, the medical anomaly of the mistreatment of COVID-19 in both inpatient and outpatient settings, the outsized influence of pharmaceutical companies and the regulatory capture of governmental agency, the polarization of debate, and the suppression of dissent under the aegis of so-called misinformation and conspiracy theory, the plight of the vaccine injured, and more and more and more. As I said, this first volume is called Two Roads, an American Scholar's COVID Chronicle. And you might pick up that there are references to both Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American scholar, and also Robert Frost, his poem, The Road Not Taken, is there. And those references to these American literary figures is not at all incidental, because the volumes, the series as a whole, is really engaged with a lot more than COVID. It's really, as Kieran so artfully indicated, about America, the idea of America, spiritual democracy, what is the basis of democracy, spiritually, psychologically, and really the angel, if you will, or the archetypal idea that informed the founding of this country, and which I saw to some degree unraveling or profoundly at risk or damaged in the COVID area. And that, of course, that continues in a different vein to the present day. America as an idea and the free world, which cannot really be separated from each other, in my mind. The idea of a democratic society in the modern era, America is at the vanguard of that. And of course, it was birthed during the Enlightenment in the 18th century. So the reference to the quest for enlightenment that's in the subtitle is a very deliberate reference to both the Enlightenment era, but also the idea of what a truly enlightened social polity really needs to look like. And as well, the spiritual overtones of a search for an enlightened frame of mind, a spiritually awake frame of mind. We often associate enlightenment to some degree with Eastern paths, but of course it has a resonance for, a Western mind as well, a seeking of illumination. And of course it finds its way into the title of the second volume, The Apocalypse of the Modern Mind, the subtitle of which is COVID and the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Now, the second volume really focuses, in contrast to the first, on deeper historical and philosophical perspectives of the ideological background from which COVID phenomenon might emerge. So it goes back into really in-depth some of what I see as the intellectual history to try and understand what transpired and why. And the idea, and this is, so it focuses on the modern era, And the reference to apocalypse of the modern mind is a reference to the idea that I think we see at present, and very much so in an intensified form at present, a kind of unraveling of what we've known as the kind of consensus of what constitutes the free world and the values and the norms that for so long in certain forms have kind of upheld the structure of Western democracy, of liberal democracy. And apocalypse can have a very negative sense, but again, as Kieran mentioned, technically or etymologically, the word means that taking away of the veil, tearing away of the veil, and of course, that's the meaning too of the biblical book of Revelation. It means a revelation, because a spiritual awakening always involves an uncovering of the darkness that was there precluding that. And so the reference to it, the scope of this book is really quite broad. It engages politics, current events, science, which is of course central to the modern era, history, literature, philosophy, and it tries to deal with all these dimensions in a fashion that sees a unified form of culture, for example, in the Enlightenment era, in the 18th century. And that's because all dimensions of culture are fundamentally related. Whether or not the connections between science and philosophy and religion and art are readily apparent. And to understand a phenomenon as important as COVID, one needs to comprehend the whole nexus of culture that forms not only the background of the phenomenon, but also constitutes its effective cause. And it's kind of the theory that informs the books that COVID was not so much of a natural accident, something just happened, but it was an effect and symptom of modern culture in all its varied and interlocking aspects. And so as psychologists, we should certainly be familiar with the fact that something that manifests as an external phenomenon often has its sources, it's an actual manifestation or a symptom of psychological or soul causes. So the book tries to investigate those and has this kind of much broader purview. It's divided into 4 parts. And the first part is called The Great Reset and the Dialectic of Enlightenment. And it begins by trying to give a sketch of what I call the matrix, which is a reference to the Wachowski. How many people know the film The Matrix? Yes. So the name of the kind of technocratic apparatus that is part of this force which you see portrayed in that film in a very vivid way. Many critics have reflected upon how that film is as much reality in a way as science fiction, that there's this system of power that actually operates, that involves industry and corporate interests like big pharma and big tech, government, university and research institutions that promulgates the science that we're supposed to follow, healthcare systems and hospitals and their protocols, the media and its apparatus, that there's a kind of matrix of power that that you saw during COVID was all operating in lockstep in an almost uncanny fashion. and that the citizenry, the people, are kind of at the bottom of this pyramid of power. And this form of technocracy, which tends to take authoritarian forms, and it can flow into a left-leaning authoritarianism or a right-leaning authoritarianism, or a combination of both, which I think we're kind of seeing at present. We can have the global technocracy and Bill Gates on the one hand, and these kind of shadow powers that are exercising so much influence, as we saw in COVID, on the one hand, not, and that the gears behind that machine are not necessarily exposed. Or we can flip to an in-your-face authoritarianism, which we're getting now, which harkens back to monarchy. But the technocratic apparatus can work with either kind of configuration. So that the subtitle, Great Reset and Dialectic of Enlightenment, is a reference to Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer's classic work of criticism called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. Anybody familiar with Adorno and Horkheimer, that book? Yeah, the Frankfurt School. So Adorno and Horkheimer are Germans who wrote this book in the wake of the takeover on the part of the Nazis and the Third Reich. They had to flee Germany. I think they wrote the book around 1944, 1945. So they're really writing it in response to the rise of fascism in Germany. And they put forth the theory that authoritarianism of the sort that took place in Germany is actually the logical outcome of Enlightenment thinking, of Enlightenment rationalism, and the ascendancy of scientific rationalism to the throne of power. And here's a quote from the book. A cogent argument can be made that the totalitarian nightmare represented by the Matrix or Great Reset technocracy represents the logical culmination of Enlightenment thinking and the liberal ideology associated with it. And the Dialectic of Enlightenment is a very powerful book. It's also very dense, difficult to summarize. But the essence of that argument is one that's not too difficult to grasp. The essence of the argument is that Enlightenment rationalism, when it gets reduced to scientism, reduces human beings to numbers, to statistics, to bits and parts, and that we cease to be regarded as autonomous units of agency with inherent value, but we become cogs in some kind of technocratic machine which can be controlled by those pulling the levers of power. And it's always supported by one or another ideology, be it that of Nazism and the eugenic program that was behind some of the fascist ideology there, or programs that we're witness to in our present day. There's some kind of moral sanction given. And in COVID, that everybody should get vaccinated because that's going to save the most lives, right? The individual right of a person is subordinated to a statistical calculation of what stands for the good of all. And that is based on science. We have to follow the science which gives us supposedly the truth. The challenge and the pitfall in that is that, contrary to the popular saying that numbers don't lie, there's nothing that lies more readily and easily than numbers, in that scientific results, what science has done, what science says, can be very, very readily manipulated. And I certainly have the perspective that there was a great deal of that going on during COVID, and provided the moral sanction, this reduction of reality to statistics, often based on models that had nothing to do actually with reality. I mean, in the one of the appendix to book one, I criticize a New York Times article. I think the author was David French, who was criticizing the Republicans in part for their anti-vaccine posture, claiming that vaccines would save, and then there was some figure, I don't remember what it was, something like 1.2 million lives or something like that, presented as authoritative fact in the New York Times. So you look at what study he cites as a support for that figure, and it's a study that comes out of the Brown School of Public Health, prestigious institution, Brown University, right? So you go to the Brown, so you try and find a study on the Brown University Public Health website. So you have to go to the department that's dealing with vaccines and epidemiology. Okay, the first thing you're confronted with when you're looking for that study is all this information about what Brown University is doing in the vaccine area. And guess what it looks like? Are there any questions about the nature and safety or efficacy of vaccines? It's all looks like propaganda. It's all how many shots can we get in how many arms. That's what you are confronted with. There's no questions asked. It's all vaccine promotion. And then you find out, of course, that Brown University Public Health is being essentially subsidized by the NIH under Fauci's rule, and then you try and locate this study, and you have a devil of a time doing it because they aren't really putting the science up front, right? And if you do finally find the study, which I do, you then look for the assumptions that are written into the model, because this is just a model that they're working on. And you want to find out what kind of assumption of vaccine efficacy is in this model that is telling us that vaccines are saving, a million lives. And it's not divulged anywhere. They're simply assuming an 85 to 90% absolute efficacy of the vaccine in the model. And on that basis, they say it would have saved so many lives. And that's reported in the New York Times, in fact, as proof, that the vaccines would have saved umpteen lives, when in fact, the model is simply assuming as an assumption what it supposedly is proving there. And you find that kind of thing over and over again. That's part of the ideology that fuels what Adorno and Horkheimer call the dialectic of enlightenment. And they come to a couple of kind of vivid quotes from that book. Enlightenment stands in the same relationship to things as the dictator to human beings. Industrialism makes souls into things, and they end up in the place that of enlightenment is totalitarian. System of total control, total rationalization, which in many regards we were subject to during COVID. I mean, the degree to which the detail, the minutiae of people's lives were controlled by a global system was just almost unbelievable, right? Okay, so that's where Adorno and Horkheimer end up, and we see it reflected still today in many aspects. But isn't there another side to enlightenment? The salient positive features of enlightenment, the ground of human liberty, universal rights, the very ideas of liberal democracy in our modern world, the truly liberal values that most of us would espouse and see as the foundation of our moral canon. So if one recognizes that there is that side as well, then there's a conundrum, a puzzle that presents itself, which I call the puzzle of the dual legacy of the Enlightenment. Because it was the Enlightenment that freed us from religious persecution, incredible intolerance, feudalism, and so a lot of repressive structures. So this problem, the dual legacy of the Enlightenment, can be phrased as follows. How is it that the same ideas that played so vital a role in catalyzing the revolutionary movements that gave rise to liberal democracy function as the ideological ground of that same political, economic, and culture's initiatives' internal rupture and disintegration? How do you flip from authentic liberal democracy and government of, by, and for the people, and societies that really provided an unprecedented degree of human freedom, into a society of an autocratic rule, still supposedly sticking to the same premises in a way? So that's kind of the problem that the book tries to undertake to look at. And many critics who are very, very prescient in their understanding of the negative features of the Enlightenment. I'm thinking of, for instance, of Paul Kingsnorth, who has a book called Against the Machine. That's a very probing analysis of this. But he and many conservatives then kind of endorse, well, what we really need is we need traditional religious values. We need to go back to the community and local cultures that ground people in those kinds of values. Well, that utterly ignores, finally, which they say you at the same time can't ignore, the accomplishments of modernity, of the emancipatory advancements represented by the ideas. We can't go back. And we don't want to go back to pre-modern forms of political culture or theological culture. So to understand this conundrum, one has to really understand what is enlightenment, actually. And I'm going to just read a little passage from Volume 2, because this question is itself a historic one. And I'm taking this as a passage from historian Anthony Pagden's book on Enlightenment. In December 1783, the Berliner Monatsschrift, a widely read and generally progressive journal, published an article by a theologian and educational reformer named Johann Friedrich Zöllner. The article might have passed unnoticed if it had not been for a single footnote. What is enlightenment? Zöllner asked. This question, which is almost important as what is truth, should indeed be answered before one begins enlightening. And still, I have never found it answered. That's from Zöllner. Back to Pagden. It was perhaps the most significant footnote in the entire history of Western thought. It was certainly the most widely discussed. 6 years later, shortly before the outbreak of the French Revolution, the German poet and philosopher Christoph Martin Wieland, once described as the German Voltaire, while seated on the toilet and reaching for what he coyly calls a maculature, in other words, a piece of toilet paper, found, not without a slight shudder of astonishment, that the sheet of good white soft paper he held in his hand and printed on it 6 questions, the first of which was, what is enlightenment? So the book asks that question, and I come up with my own answer. 6 bullet points, the first of which is sapere aude, which is a famous quotation that Kant takes from Horace, which means dare to know. That enlightened means having the intellectual courage to answer questions for yourself, to rely upon your own intellect and not take truth on the basis of authority, expert authority, supposedly expert authority. And this, of course, is written all over the revolutionary movements of the early modern era. Descartes, and in some very positive forms. And then there's the value of studying nature, close observation of the actual natural world, part of the scientific revolution. Humanism in the age of reason, the valuation of individual reason, and the focus on the human being rather than a theocentric viewpoint. Ideas of progress, good side and bad side, but that humanity is evolving towards a future that's more important than the past, which it was not really the pre-modern mentality at all. The Statute of Liberty, which has to do with the relation of the individual and the state, and the party of humanity, an idea of a universal humanity, universal rights, a universality to the human condition that means that we should treat African Americans as having equal rights to white Americans, and across the board, men and women and so forth. All these are Enlightenment values, come out of that era. So then the question is, how do they get deformed into an ideological basis for autocratic rule? And of course, each of the positive features of these ideas have a shadow side, and it would be much too involved to go one by one through them here. But my simple answer to the question is how the deformation happens is that if the philosophy, the worldview reality gets reduced to a materialistic paradigm, which comes to dominate science, and this quantification and making all truth measurable, this rejection of any kind of solar spirits that's independent from matter, and so on and so forth. And science assumes the throne of culture, which it certainly still occupies today, and becomes the pawn of technology, and the Baconian dictum that knowledge is power. We're acquiring the kind of knowledge that can be translated into practical power, and that's the end of our truth-seeking. Well, that kind of scientism, that kind of quantification, that kind of materialism underwrites the ascent of the shadow side, the dark side of all these very enlightened values. It's a complex and difficult dynamic, but I think everybody with their eyes open can see that today. I mean, that's how we get to AI, and that's how we get to, the horizon of our present, which isn't dominated so much by COVID, but very much by artificial intelligence and what that can bring, which is very much of a piece with mRNA vaccines and the kind of psychology and ideology operating in the COVID era. So what I would like to do to finish my little portion before I open it up to discussion is and questions is I would like to read about 15, max 20-minute passage from the chapter in Apocalypse of the Modern Mind that's called COVID and the Riddle of the Sphinx. Because I think this puts in good perspective some of the issues that I've been trying to raise. So this is chapter 11, COVID and the Riddle of the Sphinx, and it begins with the quotation from the Frost poem. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I concluded part one of Reset or Renaissance, Two Roads, an American Scholar's COVID Chronicle, with these lines from Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, in late July of 2021, roughly 1 year and many pages ago. Those lines are every bit as apropos now as then, and the choice they imply remains world important. On one level, the book you are reading revolves around COVID-19. On another deeper level, it concerns itself with the far broader subject of that fork in the road. Like Frost's traveler, we are all at a crossroads, faced with a fateful decision. That decision does not so much focus upon one or another concrete matter, whether to vaccinate yourself or your children, for instance, as critically important as these may be. The question posed is full of still more portent. As I contemplate the matter, the image of a crossroads, a classical topos, puts me in mind of Oedipus and his rendezvous with the Sphinx, a moment of destiny, if there ever was one. From her cliff perch outside the city of Thebes, the Sphinx had been terrorizing the populace, seizing upon any and all travelers to or from the city. She would pose a riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening, and would mercilessly devour all who could not solve it. None could, until Oedipus, employing his keen intellect like a sharpened sword, responded, man. He crawls on all fours as a babe, stands firm and upright in the noontide of life, and when the dusk of age closes in upon his stooped shoulders, goes upon a staff or cane into the night. The Sphinx, her puzzle solved and power broken, cast herself down from her lofty perch, and so was destroyed. Did Oedipus receive fit reward for his victory? Certainly. Having freed Thebes from the curse of the Sphinx, Oedipus becomes not only its king, but husband of the widowed queen, Jocasta. A snappy, happy ending to the course of affairs? Hardly. This, after all, is Greek tragedy. Sophocles rocking the cradle of Western civilization. Oedipus, while a brilliant thinker, was also a passionate hothead with serious anger issues. Moreover, while very good at figuring out the kind of intellectual puzzle posed by the Sphinx, he was a far less insightful interpreter of the deeper sort of riddles pronounced as prophecy. Before all of the above events, the oracle at Delphi had informed Oedipus that he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. Appalled at the prospect, He had set out on the road to Thebes, venturing far from home in an effort to evade that sordid fate. Unfortunately, in so doing, Oedipus, mistaken as to his true parentage, unwittingly fulfilled it. En route to Thebes, Oedipus, on foot, encountered a chariot at a crossroads. The driver imperiously commanded Oedipus to yield the right of way, and the royal-looking personage inside hurled callous insults at him when he would not. Oedipus, enraged, killed them both. Little did he know that the man inside was Laius, king of Thebes, Oedipus's own father. The fatal altercation at the crossroads transpired not so very long before Oedipus met the Sphinx on her perch outside the city, solved her riddle, became king of Thebes and husband to Queen Jocasta. Even if you don't know already, I'm sure you can guess the identity of Oedipus's real mother. But the gods, never mind that they had arranged the whole affair, did not look kindly upon patricide and incest. They granted Oedipus and Jocasta years of peace and prosperity, as well as 2 daughters and 2 sons, but ultimately made sure that the wages of sin were paid. Mysteriously, without external sign or warning, disaster struck the city. If life in Thebes had been desperate on account of the Sphinx, the city now suffered a terrible plague inside its own limits. People sickened, and the broad hand of death covered the land in dark shadow. The play itself opens as a chorus of afflicted citizens, applies to the savior hero King Oedipus, whose keen mind had saved them once before, for remedy. Their spokesperson describes the people's plight in this moving plea. A god that carries fire, a deadly pestilence is on our town, strikes us and spares us not, and the house of Cadmus is emptied of its people, while Black Death grows rich in groaning and in lamentation. This sounds, does it not, like a description of COVID world in the early days in New York City, at least as a story complete with photos was reported in the New York Times. Oedipus, compassionate ruler that he is, promises to do all within his power to alleviate the plague. Soon a messenger, Creon, Oedipus's brother-in-law and uncle, returns from the oracle, and at Oedipus's command discovers to all present the source of the city's affliction, spiritual pollution stemming from the unavenged murder of the late King Laius. This news encourages Oedipus, who publicly vows to undertake all necessary measures to identify the murderer, the culprit that has brought doom upon Thebes. There is grand and fatal irony here. While intellectually clever Oedipus had solved the riddle of the Sphinx and so answered the question pertaining to the nature of man in the abstract, he possessed no real knowledge as to his own personal identity. He did not know his place of birth, his parents, his lineage, nor, blinded by pride, could he control his passions, which failing led him senselessly to kill his father in a fit of road rage. That trait, moreover, persists, as evidenced by his treatment of the blind seer Tiresias, who hints at Oedipus's own guilt, and Creon in the aftermath of Creon's return from the oracle. In every way that really counts, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king, despite his ability to problem solve after a fashion that put the keys of power into his hands, and his capacity for decisive, even heroic action, did not know himself, his true identity, his I, his soul at all. That fundamental deficiency underwrites the play's tragic action. Until Oedipus discovers and somehow comes to terms with the agonizing truth that he himself is the cause of its desolation, the great city of Thebes will continue to suffer the plague that spoils the fruit of life, even on the vine. The Sphinx, sporting the body of a lion, the wings of a bird, and the face of a woman, stands for the mysteries of nature and of man, and the part each has in the other. Perhaps so long as we, metaphorically suspended somewhere between New England and Thebes, find ourselves still in a terrain of paths and crossroads, we can imagine the fork in Frost's poem as representative of two distinct approaches to the enigma of the Sphinx, two different approaches or ways of thinking about the profound riddle of man and nature. The path many have been walking, or rather hastening down, for some 4 centuries represents the first, by now more traveled, way. Francis Bacon's book, The Wisdom of the Ancients, consists of roughly 30 short essays on a variety of topics inspired by one or another ancient figure, among them Cupid or an atom, explained of the corpuscular philosophy, and Dionysus or Bacchus, explained of the passions. No sterile experimentalist in the region of the mind, Lord Bacon evidently liked to read, and still more, interpret and explain the riddling meaning of myths and fables. Fortunately for us, one of the tales he undertakes to analyze involves the very subject at hand, number 28, titled Sphinx or Science, explained of the sciences, conveniently provides us with Bacon's metaphorical distillation of the essence of the sciences, all couched in terms of an encounter with the Sphinx. Tellingly enough, Bacon's is not just any Sphinx, but explicitly Sophoclean. He begins by rehearsing the story of Oedipus's contest with the Sphinx, and so links his own reflections to this ancient Greek tragedy. The first sentence of his commentary baldly states, "Explanation. This is an elegant, instructive fable, and seems invented to represent science, especially as joined with practice." What could be more to the point of our present inquiry? Proceeding initially to identify not Oedipus, but the Sphinx herself with science, Bacon predictably ends up lauding the heroic intellect capable of solving the riddles posed by the Sphinx cum science. At the same time, he acknowledges that those not up to the task will find themselves, or their minds, literally torn apart by the terrible enigma she, nature, science, Sphinx, poses. Casual contemplation of nature's mysteries may provide pleasure, but woe to the insufficient intellect nonetheless intent upon concrete solutions. Bacon. Then it is that the Sphinx's riddles become torturing, severe, and trying, and unless solved and interpreted, strangely perplex and harass the human mind, rend it every way, and perfectly tear it to pieces. This disability, however, contrasts with the more successful man of science represented by Oedipus himself. Bacon. All the riddles of the Sphinx, therefore, have 2 conditions annexed: delaceration to those who do not solve them, and empire to those that do. For he who understands the thing proposed obtains his end, and every artificer rules over his work. We are here in the familiar terrain of scientific knowledge as power over nature. The essay continues with a clear statement of that classic Baconian position. For the true and ultimate end of natural philosophy is dominion over natural things, natural bodies, remedies, machines, and numberless other particulars. So far, Bacon's riff on Oedipus and the Sophoclean Sphinx serves but to provide poetic expression for the view of science and project of knowledge we've already described. The truly telling part of the tale, however, involves what, by Bacon's own reckoning, counts as the second kind of riddle posed by the Sphinx to man, the riddle of man's own nature, which Bacon presents as quite distinct from the first. Bacon. Sphinx has no more than two kinds of riddles, one relating to the nature of things, the other to the nature of man. And correspondent to these, the prizes of the solution are two kinds of empire, the empire over nature and the empire over man. The riddle proposed to Oedipus, so the solution whereof acquired him the Theban kingdom, regarded the nature of man. For he who has thoroughly looked into and examined human nature may in a manner command his own fortune, and seems born to acquire dominion and rule. Thus Lord Bacon, who, after adding a few ancillary plaudits praising Oedipus's worthy feat, ends the Sphinx or science on this high note. So it is that if we were to go by Bacon's account alone, we would presume that Oedipus, conqueror of nature qua Sphinx, and so king of Thebes, reigns happily ever after. His acute problem-solving mind destined to provide his realm with ever-increasing abundance and civilizational progress. We, however, know better. We know that this is not the end of the Sophoclean story. We know that where Lord Bacon lands us is not the end of the play, but rather its beginning, and that the fable of Oedipus's encounter with the Sphinx represents not the last, but the first act of what is, after all, tragic drama. If we recall what in fact transpires some years after Oedipus assumes kingship of Thebes and marries Jocasta, the terrible plague that wraps like the coils of a serpent around the city, may we not have to reevaluate how well Oedipus can be said to know the nature of man? Can a man who does not know himself truly know anything of human nature? If, moreover, Oedipus stands, as per Bacon, for the man of science, what does his fate and the fate of Thebes say about the epistemological path we have been on now for centuries? What does it say about the real source of the plague upon the city, the polis, and what must be done so that the sore affliction may at last come to an end? Think about it. Lives depend upon an answer to this riddle. If it seems too hard, take courage and remember the Enlightenment motto that comes from Horace by way of Kant: sapere aude, trust your own mind. How long are we, the people, going to suffer health experts to sit upon the throne of Thebes? How long will we continue to imagine that a science utterly and deliberately devoid of soul and of spirit can reveal to us the secret of nature or the mystery of our own human being? Will modern science, like Oedipus, ever have the courage to confront the terrible blindness that lies behind its ascent to power and command? Thank you.